So now that you understand what hypertrophy is and how it works and the anatomy of the muscle cell, the next thing I'm going to teach you about are the two different types of hypertrophy. So just as how the muscle cell is primarily made up of two different things, the myofibrils and the sarcoplasm, there are two different types of hypertrophy for each one of those components. So there is both myofibrillar hypertrophy and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Myofibrillar hypertrophy occurs when your sarcomeres get damaged and they then get rebuilt in larger numbers in parallel, and your muscle cell will also increase the number of myofibrils. Okay, so the number of little subfilaments that make up your muscle fibers is increasing when you do myofibrillar hypertrophy. This causes both an increase in muscle density and your strength as well. Then you have sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. This occurs when, through doing work such as resistance training, you deplete your muscle's energy stores at the cellular level, such as ATP, glycogen, creatine phosphate, and your fluid as well, which is what the sarcoplasm is. So sarcoplasmic hypertrophy refers to an increase in the volume of the sarcoplasmic fluid and its nutrients, which causes the muscle to grow in volume, but not density or strength. So to teach this to you better, I'm going to move this closer here. And I want you to look at all of this, all right? So imagine this is the muscle cell you start with, all right? It begins with 4 myofibrils, and the cell wall itself is just outside of them because the volume of sarcoplasmic fluid isn't greater than the space taken up by the myofibrils. Now, when you do myofibrillar hypertrophy, the sarcoplasmic fluid may not increase by much, but the myofibrils do. All right. When you do sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, the amount of myofibrils will not increase, but the amount of sarcoplasmic fluid will, thus expanding the cell to a greater volume. So this is what the muscle fiber cell would look like after each one of those types of hypertrophy was done. Keep in mind, again, this is not done to scale, okay? So it wouldn't look exactly like this. And the fact that these myofibrils are light blue and these are dark blue also is meaningless, and I don't know why it came out like that. Again, drawing circles is actually not as easy as you might think. And trying to color them in with a marker, anyways, these are the two types of hypertrophy shown in visual representation. Burn this into your mind so that you will never forget which one is which. Now, your muscle tissue is composed of approximately 70% myofibrillar proteins and 20% sarcoplasmic proteins, as well as 10% mitochondrial proteins. But you may be able to slightly change these ratios depending on the different types of training that cause the different types of hypertrophy. Okay, so you could potentially cause your muscle cells to be made up of 72.5 or 75% myofibrillar proteins if you're training in a way that causes more myofibrillar hypertrophy, or you could cause it to become 21 or 22% sarcoplasmic proteins if you're doing training that causes sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So when you do different types of training, you change the makeup of your muscle tissue, and that is because neuromuscular adaptation plays a large role in hypertrophy. Now, I know you're probably wondering what the difference is between these two types of hypertrophy. Well, myofibrillar hypertrophy is more functional because it causes an increase of strength. It has more growth potential over the long term and is more sustainable than sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. This is because you're changing the material part of the muscle rather than the amount of fluid in the cells. So this type of anatomical adaptation will be longer lasting and has greater potential over that long term. However, don't think bad of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy yet, okay? Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy can actually cause significantly more growth in the short term than myofibrillar hypertrophy. So you can get bigger faster with sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. All right, it's literally like filling your muscles as if they were a water balloon. All right, so it can give you that sort of big, bulky, sort of puffy appearance and tends to give you a more aesthetic look. All right, so bodybuilders who are going out for physique competitions are doing sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. All right, so it can make you very big, very fast, and in a way that is aesthetically pleasing. And last but not least, the type of hypertrophy training you do for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is safer than the type of training you do for myofibrillar hypertrophy. And that's because this type of neuromuscular adaptation can only be done through high force production and heavy loading. You need a very high quality of tension to cause enough disruption and damage to your myofibrils in order to cause myofibrillar hypertrophy. All right, so this is the type of hypertrophy that powerlifters get. All right, so they do get big and muscular and very strong, and their muscles are very dense and hard, but they aren't competing in physique competitions where they're trying to get the biggest muscles that look the best and have the most, striations and the most muscle fibers showing. All right, that is done through sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is caused by high rep and high volume training. That is the type of hypertrophy you're getting when you feel like you are getting a massive pump. So this causes more anaerobic glycolysis and local metabolic acidosis, which is kind of a fancy scientific word for metabolic stress, or in other words, you're getting a very metabolic workout when you are getting more and more and more and more and more and more of a pump through so many repetitions. All right, so this is what causes more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy than myofibrillar hypertrophy. And this can get you as big as or even bigger than a power lifter or strength athlete, but with only 2/3 of the force production needed to cause the same amount of myofibrillar hypertrophy. So you would be lifting 33% less of the loads to do the same amount or more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which means that with the right programming, you can actually get bigger faster. However, you are going to be doing more reps and more overall volume to cause that amount of hypertrophy. So technically, when you look at the total volume and thus the total amount of work done, you are actually doing more work in total volume to cause sarcoplasmic hypertrophy than with myofibrillar hypertrophy, where you're using heavier loads but less volume of work. Now you might be wondering, well, why is this faster if you're doing more volume of work than this? Well, because when you are lifting heavy, you have to do less work and have longer rest periods between sessions. Okay, so that's why myofibrillar hypertrophy takes more time, and you can do sarcoplasmic hypertrophy faster if you have a good way of programming all of that volume for rapid progress. However, there's another caveat, which is that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is less long-lasting, and you will lose your gains quicker if you stop training as much or as hard than you would with myofibrillar hypertrophy, where those gains will stick with you much longer after you stop training as much. So those are the two different types of hypertrophy. Now, before you go trying to decide between the two and which one you want to cause, you should know that they are not actually mutually exclusive. They will probably always occur together at the same time, but in different ratios and amounts. All right, so when we talk about myofibrillar hypertrophy, that's hypertrophy in which your myofibrils are increasing more than your sarcoplasm is increasing. All right, but your sarcoplasm would still increase a little. All right, and with sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, again, the sarcoplasmic fluid increases, but the myofibrils are going to increase a little with it. All right, and this is a good thing because this is how you should want it. All right, you shouldn't want to do one of these exclusively at the exclusion of the other, but you can certainly do either one more than the other. So let's talk about how to train for each one of these types of hypertrophy. Myofibrillar hypertrophy, as I said, is done through heavy loading. And reading a quote from Zatsiarski in 1995, strength training, which is done at 80% of your 1 rep max with reps in the 3 to 8 range with 2 to 4 minute rest periods, produces the largest changes in myofibrillar volume and density. Therefore, if you want to achieve myofibrillar hypertrophy, you must lift heavy. The heavier the weights you lift, the more muscle fibers get recruited and in turn damaged. However, it is recommended to keep the reps between 3 to 5 or so, as any lower, and it is mainly neuromuscular adaptations that improve the athlete's strength rather than myofibrillar hypertrophy. So essentially, to do myofibrillar hypertrophy, you would be doing basic strength training and the low end of hypertrophy for strength. So mostly 3 to 5, with some 6 to 8. Now, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is achieved through what is known as fatigue training. Fatigue training is training at 75% or less of your 1 rep max in the rep range of 10 to 15 with short rest periods of 45 to 90 seconds. This rapidly uses up cellular energy in muscle cells and fatigues them, okay? Or in other words, getting a very hardcore metabolic workout. So those are the two different types of hypertrophy and how they work and how to do them. And I would just like to thank muscleandstrength.com for providing those definitions for me.